World War II is, of course, the modern war in which all wars are to be measured, and it's the most popular. But to me, as a late millennial, the first war and political event that I ever became interested in as a child was the Iraq War. Since the Iraq War began, the reasons for its occurrence have been deliberately obscured. Indeed, the reasons why the Bush administration went to war have been a topic of intense debate ever afterwards. How is it possible that the origins of a war that only ended about 14 years ago and happened during a time of intense media exposure have become so obscure? Well, the ultimate goals for war and the intentions for states in going to those wars are kept secret. They are often not revealed until years later, when primary documents are made available and after the war has been depoliticized and allowed to pass into history. States who were planning on going to war manifest their intentions through justifying them in what is called as Casus Belli. A casus belli is an action or event that is believed to warrant the use of military force. While during the war itself, the casus belli is often spoken of frequently, when the war enters into the historical record, the trend is to write history as a coherent narrative using resources which at the time were unavailable to the general public in order to better understand the war and how it occurred. As such, when history is written out by historians, the ultimate goals and intentions of the war planners, which were secret at the time, become the focus of their histories, rather than the casus belli, which was used to justify the war at that time when it was happening to the public and upon the international stage. So oftentimes, in retrospective, the casus belli is kind of just buried in the total narrative of the war, and people don't really think about it years and years later when they think about the war as a whole. Though I want to keep in mind that that depends upon the war, as there are certain incidences which would likely lead to a war regardless of when they occurred, and there are also others that probably could have been resolved diplomatically, and they would have never have led into a war unless that country was looking for that war in the first place. Now, an example of, I think, a casus belli that occurred where the country that ultimately invaded the other one, that it was kind of like a black swan event, and that was always going to lead to war, is the case of World War I with Austria-Hungary. They were not looking for a war of Serbia before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, so that casus belli was not really an excuse that had been used by the Habsburg monarchy to justify a pre-existing plan for a war. Sometimes the actions of a nation are, unironically, so unacceptable and aggressive that they do justify a war on the part of the aggressor. So I just want to say, just wars do exist. Of course, there are examples in which the aggressor's justification really holds no water. And I think when we speak about the Second World War in Europe, that's definitely the case. The casus belli used by the German Reich is a joke. I'm gonna mispronounce this Polish word. I'm sorry, everybody. But anyway, the Gills-Witz incident, the supposed Polish attack upon Germany, that justified the German invasion of Poland, is one such a case. And that incident now is widely viewed as a false flag, and the German government, after the war occurred, focused very little upon that incident in its own propaganda. In reality, Germany's invasion of Poland during the Second World War was a blatant act of aggression which didn't really have any real justification. While the German territorial claims upon the Polish corridor, the city of Danzig, and complaints about discrimination of ethnic Germans within Poland, I guess there are legitimate complaints that Germany could have had and led to the German people supporting the war. The incident that led to the war, the casus belli, was a joke. Historians often instead focus on the general war aims of Germany and touch very little upon the casus belli itself when it comes to the German invasion of Poland. So historians really like to talk about you know, the Nazi Party's desire for Lebensraum, its idea of having Polish or German settlers sent to Poland, and so on, and they view that as the main reason for the war, rather than the idea that some rogue Polish soldiers blew up a radio tower. Now, let's look at Saddam Hussein's two wars of aggression, the Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War. Both the Casus Bellis, the war planning, and the war goals are clear here, actually. And I think these are clearer far more than the case of the Iraq War in 2003, when the American government was the aggressor against Iraq. With the Iran-Iraq War, the Islamic Revolution had just occurred in Iran. The Shia fundamentalist government had begun supporting Shia Islamists throughout the Middle East, especially within Iraq. Saddam had just come to de jure power there, and he, of course, was a Sunni in a Shia-majority country. Ba'ath ideology at that time was secularist, and Shia Islamism represented an existential threat to that state. In particular, Iran was beginning to support the Islamic Dawa Party, and the Dawa Party attempted to assassinate high-ranking cabinet member Tariq Aziz. I know I mispronounced it. Anyway, he's the Iraqi deputy prime minister and close friend and ally of Saddam. This provided the casus belli for Iraq to invade Iran. When it comes to Saddam's war goals and war planning here, the minimalist aim was the Iraqi government to have a better settlement in the division of the Shat el-Arab River, which separates the two countries. They already had a border war over it in 1974-1975, which was settled largely in Iran's favor in the 1975 Algiers Agreement. And the more maximal war goal on the part of Saddam was to gain the ethnic Arab and oil-rich Khuzestan province. Now, I'm playing both sides here when I'm talking about the Iraq wars, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I'm talking about both the casus belli and what is seen in retrospective as the ultimate war aims of the aggressor. So let's return back to the Gulf War of 1990-1991. The Iraqi government's casus belli came from Kuwait's slant oil drilling of Iraqi oil fields. And when it came to the war goals, Iraq always felt it had claims upon Kuwait, and the Kuwait was some kind of artificial state that was created by British imperialism. Iraq was able to capture and annex Kuwait before it was ultimately liberated by the international coalition led by the United States. So I think the goal outside of annexing Iraq, when we talk about the minimal goal, was to get Sunni leaders throughout the Middle East to forgive the debt that Iraq had gained during the Iran-Iraq War. So they had this minimal goal of debt forgiveness. If Iraq actually got away with the annexation, the maximal goal was, of course, the annexation of Kuwait, which they went for, and ultimately that the majority of the Middle East would accept the territorial annexation of Kuwait and give in to the intimidation by Iraq and, give up all the debt and everything. So then let's turn to the 2003 Iraq War, or the Second Gulf War, and let's not pull our punches. The casus belli for that war was the allegation that Iraq had sponsored terrorists to attack the United States. In particular, they sponsored Al-Qaeda, who had done the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Furthermore, that this constituted an existential threat to the United States, since the government of Iraq was supposedly developing weapons of mass destruction, which could then be used to attack the United States directly. This claim is, of course, ludicrous and laughable, so much so that the general discussion of war is almost always defined by some kind of search for an alternative motive on the part of the United States and the Bush administration. The Bush administration, of course, after no weapons of mass destruction were found, buried the embarrassing story of its initial casus belli by publicly admitting that its greater war goal was changing Iraq into a democracy, and that had been the casus belli all along, confusing the two, I guess, into just outright stating the war goal and saying that that was a casus belli. It was quite apparent that after the Saddam regime was dismantled, and this was quite apparent after the Saddam regime was dismantled and no chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear weapons were found, and it wasn't trying to develop any of them in the 12-year period since the Gulf War. And so the Bush administration thought that it would be able to dodge the criticism of its immense failure in finding these weapons by just saying, kind of like pleading to its enemies domestically, the liberal enemies, saying, we believe in democracy. Isn't democracy so great? And virtue signaling by saying the war goal out loud is the reason it went to the war. But the problem here is that leftists, they have a lot of cognitive dissonance when they try to understand what the United States is, and what the United States does, and what the United States empire is. And so, despite throwing themselves on the mercy of the idealism of the leftists, the Bush administration couldn't convince them at all of this. The leftists followed their retarded instincts that this was some kind of diversion to deflect the Bush administration from its embarrassment, and they ran off trying, but instead of them deflecting the embarrassment from a weapons of mass destruction, there was something deeper involved. And so the leftists ran off trying to find an alternative reason for the war, and they weren't going to accept that clear as day reason of spreading democracy when the Bush regime directly said that within all of its documents and within all of the neoconservative documents as well. To the leftists, though, their beautiful liberalism, which is the official ideology of the United States, that's not the ideology that the Bush administration has. No, Bush is some kind of hidden Nazi or something like that. And those dirty Beltway conservatives, they're basically like a revisionist in the Marxist regime. It doesn't matter how much they are actually liberals, because they aren't really liberals in the eyes of the conspiracy-minded, true believer liberals of the American left. And so the Bush regime couldn't be possibly fighting a war for democracy. They had to have some kind of nefarious hidden reason. And so the irony was that the idea of democracy was far more absurd. The idea of spreading democracy in America doing that, it was far more absurd than these false claims of Iraq developing weapons of mass destruction, or an alliance of the fringes between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. But leftists didn't care about that. All that they could see was that they're the true believers in democracy, and the Bush regime couldn't be true believers in democracy. So they became intoxicated on their own ideology as they were unable to perceive reality there. So the case of the Iraq War, it must have been oil, right? That's what the hidden alternative motive must be. And that's what they settled on. So you'd see all this stuff of the Iraq War was a war for oil. Whether they try to justify this through some kind of simplistic one-to-one argument with American oil companies lobbying the U.S. government directly to get contracts in the oil after the Iraq War, or they're arguing some kind of more esoteric petrodollar system conspiracy theory. This more straightforward motive is so easily debunked, it's hilarious, because the reality is that U.S. oil companies were not interested in Iraqi oil and passed it up when the bidding process happened for those oil, I want to say mines, oil rigs, I think oil fields is the right way. So anyway, in the post-invasion period, the Iraqi government put up bidding for it with the help of the American government, and a lot of the time it was actually like Chinese oil companies that developed those fields with the Iraqi government. And the American oil companies, they had little to no interest in it. Maybe it was because they didn't want to be perceived. It was a bad PR move doing so, or maybe they knew that it was a bad investment because Iraq was a basket case at that time. Or maybe the reality is that the U.S. oil companies, as we know, do not like war. They don't want there to be war with Iraq or with Iran, and they don't like embargoes on them. What has been seen historically time and time again in all their documents is that the American oil companies prefer the absence of embargoes. They go against the Israeli lobby. They want there to be peace with Arab regimes, whether they be Ba'athist Iraq, Islamist Iran or Gaddafi's regime in Libya. They want there to be peace between the United States government and those regimes so that they can have fruitful oil contracts with those regimes. And so the reality is the exact opposite of what the leftists in America say. Anyway, let's go back to the petrodollar. The petrodollar refers to the fact that oil, for the most part, internationally is traded in the U.S. dollars. The U.S. dollar kind of is the de facto global reserve currency because the United States is so powerful, and the dollar is actually, despite, what you'll hear in American media, the dollar is more stable than most other currencies around the world. The idea is that the United States invaded Iraq due to the Ba'athist regime's plan to switch out the dollar when trading oil and trade it in euros. Although, when you actually get to the documents of the Bush administration and neoconservative think tanks, this issue never even arises. So it's just kind of dead on arrival if you're going to actually do research in primary documents. Iraq had already been trading in its oil in euros for years prior to all this, and Iraq had already been part of the controversial Oil for Food program, which the UN sent up with the Clinton administration anyway, where oil was just directly traded for humanitarian aid. So the whole war for oil thing is complete garbage. Both the simplistic one-to-one direct version has no support, and the more esoteric conspiracy version of the petrodollar conspiracy theory is just as much garbage. Other rationales given for the war include a blood feud between the Bush family and the Saddam family following the Gulf War and the 1993 assassination attempt on George H.W. Bush after he left office and went around Kuwait. This theory is pretty popular in the Middle East, as it appeals to Middle Eastern cultural norms about family feuds and tribal feuds. And there are some statements and primary sources which can be used to support this. Although I think once we look at everything, it's kind of doubtful that that was the primary reason. Something that gets tied in with that idea is the idea that the George W. Bush administration, through the person of Bush himself, wanted to improve upon his father's war, some kind of insecurity of being his dad's son. Although we got to keep in mind that Deputy Secretary of Defense Wolfowitz was the one that got the ball rolling in the administration rather than Bush himself, and Wolfowitz throughout the 1990s believed that Iraq was trying to attack the United States domestically, and thoroughly believed that the 1995 World Trade Center bombing was actually championed by the Saddam government, believing in a rather obscure conspiracy theory, despite anybody's trying to give him real evidence that that wasn't the case. Anyway, another claimed reason for the war was the idea that Bush was a Christian Zionist, and he believed that the Ba'athist regime represented Magog from the Bible, and so that he personally had a duty to defeat them so he could push forward the timetable of Christ coming back. This theory is really bizarre, but it is kind of based on these bizarre kind of like briefings that Bush would give. And in front of the briefings that he got, they had all these Bible quotes on them. So that theory kind of grows out of that. But I think, again, it's dead in the water, because when Bush came into office, he didn't really have that many foreign policy goals. Again, he had been the governor of Texas, and he interacted with Mexico. But beyond that, he didn't really have a firm grasp of international politics. And so he just was kind of like this moderate Republican that was pushed forward into the presidency, who mostly wanted to champion like compassionate conservatism. And if you know that much about the Bush administration, he was ignorant of foreign policy, and he just kind of went with the grain and appointed all these neoconservatives, and because he liked Cheney as a person, and he chose Cheney to be his vice president because he saw Cheney as being very experienced in foreign policy. And so he kind of just gave Dick Cheney, when he appointed him to be vice president, a blank check to appoint all his foreign policy advisors. And Cheney, who was very tied in with the neoconservative movement, chose Rumsfeld, his close friend, and I guess you could call him his mentor, who had previously been Secretary of State under Ford, to be again Secretary of State. Bush actually apparently had won Wolfowitz, a crown neoconservative prince, to be Secretary of State, but he settled on Rumsfeld because Rumsfeld was more experienced, and Wolfowitz's highest level of experience for the job was just being ambassador to Indonesia. So that puts the footing for the war really squarely into the neoconservative movement. So the reality is that the reasons for the war are out there and available for all to know. The United States used the justification of Iraq funding Al-Qaeda and developing its weapons of mass destruction as a casus belli, but the goal ultimately was regime change and to spread democracy through the Middle East, beginning with Iraq. That is a key goal, and that's just how neoconservatives think. They have this Hegelian worldview where democracy is going to triumph and create a kind of golden age, like we're on the cusp of a golden age of international liberalism where democracy will triumph. And as opposed to, I guess, more dovish liberals, they think that it is good to actively do so through war to cause this golden age to triumph. And so they advocate war to destroy rogue regimes which prevent the internationalization of democracy and global liberal institutions. Keep in mind, though, that the entire time that this is going on, the Israeli lobby and the neoconservatives are so interconnected, I think it's fair to just say they're one and the same. And the Israeli lobby really wanted to invade Iraq because they saw it as a threat to Israel. Iraq gave cash bonuses to the families of Palestinians who died during the second, I suck at this, everybody knows this, second Intifada, and they supported various Palestinian resistance movements against Israel. Whenever Iraq or any other states were called supporters of terrorism, it wasn't really because they supported terrorism against the United States. As you'll see, most of these international terrorist groups, judged as which by the United States, they're terrorist groups because they stand against Israel. This is the case in the Palestinian groups like Hamas and the PLO, and Hezbollah, the Lebanese group. Both of these are enemies of Israel. And so the United States categorizes these armed resistance movements and militias against Israel as terrorist groups. And the reality is they're not any real threat to the United States. They're a threat to Israel. And the Israeli lobby is able to puppet the American, especially the Senate, but also the House and the presidency to do this. The Israeli lobby's interest in the invasion of Iraq acted as a multiplier effect for the Bush administration's desire to invade that country. Following the end of the Cold War, the Israeli lobby became the most important and strongest voice in shaping America's foreign policy. This can be seen with the overwhelming amount of U.S. interventions and attention that has been given to the Middle East since the Gulf War. The reason that this happens is that every time that policymakers in the United States have an opportunity to intervene in the Middle East, the Israeli lobby uses that and its massive political influence to push very hard in the favor of that intervention. In effect, the Israeli lobby's vast power increases the feasibility of any intervention in the Middle East that it agrees with. While normally it would take a lot of political capital for the federal government on its foreign policy side to do something like a war of aggression, once the Israeli lobby is on board and sets its sight for that war, it actually flips over, and it takes significantly more political capital to deny and prevent the Israeli lobby from getting that war than it would have been to, say, do a war of aggression in any other part of the world. To put it another way, you need to spend political capital in most cases to start a war, but if that war is something that Israel wants, you need to spend an immense amount of political capital to prevent that war. So as soon as 9/11 happened, and I mean the literal calendar day of 9/11, hours afterwards, Paul Wolfowitz said it's time to invade Iraq due to his personal obsession with Iraq. using 9/11 as a casus belli without having a shred of connection at all, even fabricated at that time. And this is literally directly in primary documents we have at this stage. Bush dismissed it initially, but as time went on, he would find himself stuck in this vicious cycle where the Israeli lobby kept pushing him further and further into it. Israel outright began fabricating data to justify the Israeli lobby began outright fabricating data to justify the administration's casus belli for that war. And the lobby whipped both the Democrats and Republicans in the Congress into going through with an offensive war against Iraq. The Israeli lobby had already been doing this before 9/11, as we see with the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998, a bill which was passed unanimously by the Senate and by a supermajority in the House of Representatives. This bill, which was championed by the Israeli lobby and what you could call the regime change lobby of expats for Iraq, which is highly interconnected with the neoconservative movement and, of course, highly interconnected with the Israeli lobby, championed. And this bill basically is a declaration of war with Iraq without committing an invasion force to do it. It says that it makes the United States official foreign policy to overthrow the Ba'athist government. That was a literal law that was passed. Just our goal now is to topple your government. It's so aggressive, and it's hilarious because it's basically this declaration of war, but it didn't go all the way because it didn't commit troops yet. So I think even if Gore won, he would have to contend with that. Clinton, of course, didn't want it, but with the Senate, who is insanely philo-Semitic, supported it with 100 senators voting for it. There was nothing that Clinton could do despite him actively opposing it, because it was forcing him into trying to literally start a war of aggression with Iraq. While America may have been justified in invading the war with false connections between the Ba'athists and Al-Qaeda, America's actual war aim was the satanic goal of neoconservatism. That satanic goal being emasculating the human race with democracy to cause universal and unending peace. And they were going to use this war to do so. America's goal in the war didn't have to be explicitly to fight the war on behalf of Israel. It was just that the lobby knew that such a war would benefit them, so they latched onto it. Even if the primary goal of the war was democracy in an Arab country, and the justification was the ludicrous idea of weapons of mass destruction and support for Al-Qaeda. Israel latched onto it and pushed it forward with all the might of its political capital. Well then, what that begs the question, what is political capital? Political capital are the resources and support a political actor can draw on to get their agenda done through the system. And this is something that is true across every type of political system, whether that be a liberal democracy, a monarchy, a military dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, or a communist dictatorship. The political actor needs political capital in order to get their agenda done. The thing about this is that each agenda only has so much political capital it can muster. Not all agendas are built equally, and the pushbacks against those agendas are not built equally either. Let's look at examples for this with some administrations. When it comes to the first Trump administration, the first term, his goals and his ability to achieve them were uneven in the political capital he can muster for them. On the campaign trail, Trump really seemed to have cared about ending illegal immigration, securing the border, and reducing crime connected to illegal immigration. He was also pretty focused on protectionism. Now, that there's reasons to be protectionist for national policy and national security reasons, or to prevent foreign influence in the country, or, basic belief in protectionism as protectionism, defending manufacturing jobs. But he also wanted to change the tax code. And this tax reform, that was pretty secondary compared to what he was talking on the campaign trail. Once he got into office, though, what was the most successful thing and which had the most political capital in its support? The 2017 tax code. So what ended up happening is that the only real major policy change when Trump was president and the Republicans had control of the House and the Senate was the 2017 tax code. Changes to immigration like the RAISE Act never went forward, and he was opposed even when it came to using his own powers to change it, and the Republican Congress and Senate didn't even want to support his wall. The secondary thing, protectionism, that got some support, but again, there was pushback against that compared to the 2017 tax plan. Because the difference in Trump's ability to get each part of his agenda done didn't really have that much to do with what he wanted most. It had to do with what was able to get the most amount of political capital, and conversely, what had the most pushback that could be mounted against it. And so Trump was only able to accomplish goals there which were easier and had more political capital in support of them. Likewise, he gravitated towards those things and used his own political capital on things he knew he would be able to achieve. The things that he knew that it would be harder to achieve, he tended to focus less upon. So that's something you have to understand whenever you have a Democrat or a Republican in power. They're going to move towards the policies that they support that they have more chance of getting a victory on. So let's turn back to the George W. Bush administration. Bush's focus was on education reform and banning gay marriage. That was before 9/11 happened, and that was his focus on the campaign trail in 2000. He was successful in getting his education reform done because it had a significantly less pushback when it came to the gay stuff. Ultimately, it would be superseded, though, in Obama's Common Core. The constitutional amendment to preemptively ban gay marriage, well, we all know that didn't work out. Once Bush became a crusader, though, in the war on terror in the international stage following 9/11, he got the immense political power of the Israeli lobby on his side to basically give him a blank check to do whatever he wanted, at least until the losses in the 2006 election. Bush then moved forward with his goals, which were easier, and in that case, that was foreign intervention in Iraq. And, support for Israel in the Lebanon war and putting the screws on Iran. Because he had a higher chance of achieving these goals and that there was significantly less pushback, so he's going to use his attention and energy to achieve the goals which are easier and more achievable. Keep in mind, in a liberal or democratic system like the United States, lobbies essentially generate political capital, and that's outside of the capital that the politicians move to form themselves, and politicians will go with what is already waiting for them when they come into office. Instead of trying to generate their desires on their own, they tend to just swim with the water, and that was the case with Bush, and sorry to say that was the case with Trump during his first term. And that will be the case with Obama and Biden and both presidents of either party. Anyway, in more authoritarian systems, the leader plays a more active role in deciding policy. The primary reason for this is that an autocrat, because he's in there basically indefinitely, he shapes things over time as he sees fit. Most political parties then are stuck in in a democratic system, we should say. It's a contrast because parties are stuck in the circular arrangement where they're coming in and out of power, and they have a short policy, they have a short window to use their policy to shape the system. In the United States, with its presidential system, the president only has short 4-year terms, and he has hard term limits of only 2 terms. So, when you have a leader which is largely independent in an authoritarian system, he's able to shape the system over time, and so the political capital he needs to do any one objective becomes easier and easier over time as the whole system kind of breaks down and starts to form him as a person. In contrast, in a democratic system, the president or the prime minister or whoever is always forced, if they want to, they're always forced to try and swim with the tide of the lobbies, or swim with the tide of the capitalists, or swim with the tide of the NGOs. And they always are under a very short time crunch. As a result, you see in a democratic system that you have this kind of system that develops, and that the actors, the politicians, they're really unable to shape the system, and the system exists above and beyond any individual actor. So the system kind of acts as this coherent entity which acts in its own interest beyond that of the politicians, and they are merely passing and bit players. And so that this leads over time, and you'll see this as kind of a decay in politicians in liberal societies. You'll see at the beginning, you'll have stronger, more capable presidents. Think of somebody, and they are often the founders of republics. Think of somebody like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so on, compared, say, a de Gaulle in France, or an Adenauer in West Germany. But as time goes on, you have less and less capable politicians that take control of the country, and they became more and more of like these cronies that just go with the flow rather than trying to shape policy. And so at the beginning of democratic systems, you'll still get these kind of great men of history, but as democratic systems go on, you get weaker and weaker politicians who are less and less charismatic and less capable as the system declines and starts to collapse. And that's what we're seeing across the West and across most democratic systems in general. Anyway, let's return back to the main topic. Bush certainly was no dictator, and so he was trapped by this system which limited the American presidency. He was a slave to pre-existing powers which shaped the American governmental system and its policy. In the case of his foreign policy, he was stuck doing the bidding of the Israel lobby, not necessarily out of some kind of malevolence on his part, but because it was convenient, and that's what he could get done. This led to the abandonment of the peace process between Palestine and Israel, something that Clinton had wanted and something that Bush, when he came in, wanted and supported. This also led America into supporting Israel's idiotic invasion of Lebanon in 2006 with the idea of destroying Hezbollah, which, obviously that failed. Hezbollah continued for some time after that, being a threat to Israel. It led Bush to rebuff the Iranian president, Mohammed Khamenei. It's Khatami. So anyway, he was this liberal who was against the mullahs, and his idea was that he was going to try and push Iran away from being an international pariah state, and he'd push Iran more into a liberal democratic trajectory. You got to keep in mind that the Iranian constitution is so labyrinthine and so Byzantine that it's hard to really make heads or tails of it. And so if you really did have this independent actor who was able to shape things, I think that the Iranian presidency could move power away from the supreme leader and make them ceremonial. And he really was dead set on trying to turn Iran into a more liberal democracy and kind of shaping, which at this point, even today, is kind of a fluid constitution. And what he was going to do is he wanted to make peace with America and Saudi Arabia on the world stage, and even Israel to a certain extent, and kind of regularize the country, get the embargoes ended. But, that didn't happen. Even though Bush had somebody to work with akin to a Reagan or the first Bush and Gorbachev case with Iran, Bush pushed harder and harder against Iran at the whole axis of evil thing, and the whole Iran's going to develop nuclear weapons any day now, trust me bro stuff. And the Bush regime kind of flushed in the toilet because it swam with the current of the Israel lobby, which was, of course, opposed to any kind of regularization of Iran. And ultimately, that meant that Iran would move back towards Islamism, and that the liberal democratic push that Khamenei was pushing towards failed. Maybe it would have failed regardless. Again, I think that domestically that's the real determiner, and we're just being super sophist, you could say, when we're saying stuff like, the Chomsky stuff like Pinochet was a puppet of Nixon, right? But Bush could have actually pursued friendship with Khomeini and tried to support this reform in Iran, but it did everything in its power to prevent it. And there's other problems here. This led Bush to rejecting overtures of cooperation that the Ba'athist regime in Syria and Iraq wanted, because both these regimes, al-Assad and Saddam's regimes, they were not supportive of Salafist revolutionary terrorists. They did not want Islamic governance. I guess to a certain extent Saddam wanted some kind of moderate Salafism or moderate Shia Islamism, but he was not in support of Al-Qaeda. He was not in support of international terrorism. And both those regimes, despite previous animosity and difficulty with the United States after 9/11, and this is not talked about very often, they reached out and sent peace feelers and said, we will be your allies of convenience. We are against you in this war of terror. Remember when Bush went to his speech and said, you're either with us or against us? Well, the reality of the situation is both Syria and Iraq said, we're with you, we're against them. Bush, of course, rejected that and pushed towards the Iraq war, idiotically. And so you have this problem here that we're going to see in history, because during the no-fly zone after the initial Gulf War, that was where the Americans and the Anglos, the British, if you will, and the French for a period until 1996 supported a no-fly zone and periodically attacked the Saddam and the Ba'athist regime in Iraq throughout 1991 until 2003. They were undermining Iraqi sovereignty, and this led to the northern part of Iraq, the Kurdistan region, dominated by the ethnic Kurds, being de facto independent or at least extremely autonomous, and Iraq not being a sovereign country, and Kurdistan became a very lawless region. And what happened in that lawless region? Well, Islamist groups were able to base there. And a certain terrorist group, which I'm going to mispronounce, Jamata al-Tawhid it's Wa Jihad, Zawahiri's group, well, they were able to hide out there. And so, despite the fact that they were opposed to Saddam and so on, and Saddam was opposed to them, Saddam had no power over this region because of the United States. And so the United States started to fabricate, and its allies who wanted the war in the lobby, the Israeli lobby, and the pro-Iraq war lobby under Ahmed Chalabi, they started to fabricate these ideas that Zarqawi not Bush, that'd be funny, but Zarqawi and Saddam are directly connected, when the reality was the opposite. The United States is directly preventing Saddam from defeating these Islamic groups. And so after the 2003 invasion happens, Zarqawi is going to be bolstered in power, and his terrorist group is going to transform into Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would ultimately transform into ISIS, the terrorist group that, I don't even want to call it a terrorist group, the country that conquered half of Syria and a third of Iraq, right? That killed tens of thousands of people, killed millions of Christians, Shias, and other religious minorities. That was because of this idiotic Iraq war. And Saddam wanted to partner with America to defeat them before this all happened. And this was part and parcel of the consequences of the Israeli lobby's influence. So let's return back. The Iraq War, all in all, was an ideological war which was waged to spread global democracy. I want to stress that, and I want to stress that I don't think it's a facade. This was not bluntly a war for Israel, But the reality is that when considering the political capital and considering the deep interconnectedness of the Israeli lobby and the neoconservatives, that they saw this war as beneficial for Israel, and so they pushed it forwards with the whole weight of their movement. And that gave Bush an unparalleled positive political capital in order to do something that was completely idiotic: the invasion of Iraq.